Okay. So welcome and good afternoon, everyone. This workshop is being recorded for public release afterwards. Thank you for joining us today for this first workshop on knowledge mobilization, hosted by ARCU, the Environment Division for the Chemical Institute of Canada, and CMAS, of which ARCU is a special interest group. I'll start by introducing your co-hosts for today. I'm Hind Alabadley, a professor of chemistry at Wilfrid Laurier University, which is situated on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I am also the vice chair of ARCU, a special interest group at CMAS, and the chair of the Environment Division of the Chemical Institute of Canada. I wish to thank the executive teams of ARCU and the CIC Environment Division for supporting today's workshop. And special thanks go to Fatima Ijaz from UFT, who set up the registration page and all the Zoom-related parts of today's event. And happy to have her joining us today as well as an observer. Co-hosting with me is Kian Kim. Oh, hi, Kian.
Hi, everyone. I'm a science communication specialist joining from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I'm grateful to be a part of this workshop present in this territory. So I do have a couple of housekeeping things to kind of go over for today's workshop. We will be holding the Q&A session at the very end once all our speakers are done. However, we strongly encourage you to use the Q&A button to submit questions throughout the workshop, and you're also welcome to drop them in the chat function as well, and I'll do my best to keep track of all of them in addition to the Q&A.
Thank you, Kian. The discussion to host this workshop began last year at a meeting for ARCU's advisory board. As a special interest group, ARCU's open meetings and communication via the email listserv have been and continue to be a source of information and advocacy by and for atmospheric scientists, chemists, engineers from academia, government, and industry. Since the release of the Climate Science 2050 report last year, this is the third event ARCU hosts to learn more about the report and discuss its content. We hope that this workshop is the first in a series of workshops aimed at connecting with you and learning about the different ways of knowledge generation, synthesis, and mobilization, and best practices in wider community outreach. Now I'd like to welcome the speakers and thank them for agreeing to participate in today's workshop. We'll start with Marjorie Shepherd, the Director of Environment and Climate Change Canada Climate Research Division, and the Senior Climate Change Science Advisor. Marjorie has been with ECCC for over 2 decades and currently represents Canada internationally for 2 commissions of the World Meteorological Organization. So give you a minute, I'm going to share the slides that Marjorie is going to present, and therefore we can go ahead and advance the slides whenever Marjorie tells me to.
Thank you very much, Hind. I'm really happy to be here and be part of this conversations, and I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Mississaugas, the Attawandaronk, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee nations. So let's just jump right into the next slide. It's not just about the science you're trying to communicate. It's not just about getting the information into somebody else's head. It really is being part of something much bigger. You are part of a whole process around science integrity, which is the doing and the reporting on of the science and providing science advice. And it's a role in bringing the evidence to decision-making. You're part of building relationships. You are part of a science policy dialogue, a science to action conversation when you are bringing your science to the table, to the community. And it's all part of building trust and understanding that policy or regulatory pull. So you need to know who you're working with and establish relationship. And in that relationship, you're creating space. You're creating space for expert voices to provide their knowledge and their science advice. So always find a way to think, what context are you part of in that larger policy, regulatory, or program discussion? So next slide. you have to know your audience. And some of my experience, starting back with Arctic Council and the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, or the Canada-US Air Quality Accord, or even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, all of those processes where science is brought to the table in a very formal way starts with talking to your audience and scoping that science assessment work with them to make sure that you are providing what will be relevant and will resonate with them. Sometimes you might do it in the form of mapping out the table of contents together, or developing a series of policy relevant science questions that you hope this science assessment will be able to answer. But taking that moment at the beginning, whether it's a formal science assessment or a conversation over coffee, to know your audience will help you set up for success. Next slide, please. And so you have to be ready to deliver your science in multiple sizes and colors. One of my favorite resources is now a couple of years old, called Making Sense of Science for Policy Under Conditions of Complexity and Uncertainty. So today. And even though when you print it out, it's about 2 centimeters thick, it is a good read. And what it talks about is the role of science advice coming through a very rigorous process, agreed upon rules of scientific inquiry, peer review, analysis, debate, repeat. And part of that is being transparent, being ready for the public scrutiny and accountability, and understanding what's going to count as good evidence, because that'll vary depending in the context you are talking in. And be ready to package your science in different ways beyond the standard journal articles. Be ready for that plain language summary and an opportunity to have it reflected in some larger science assessment. Maybe there are social media opportunities. Maybe there is a reflection in after a review paper in a summary for policymakers, a white paper, or a technical summary. It won't be just the journal article. Next slide. So what I'm working on now as a senior climate change science advisor for Environment and Climate Change Canada is developing a national climate change science plan that builds from this Climate Science 2050 report we did a little over a year ago. And that whole process has been one of listening. I think it is an important responsibility of the scientist to listen to the program, the policy, the regulatory community, and find a way to bring information that is responsive to their needs. So the entire Climate Science 2050 and National Science Planning context is based on really 2 streams. One is the development of new knowledge, undertaking new research and monitoring, which is very important to inform ongoing refinements for climate action. But just as important as developing new knowledge is making sure that we are getting the most out of that investment we have made in the science we've done to date, the knowledge mobilization, the science communication. So this effort for the National Science Plan is moving forward on 2 fronts. Develop more new knowledge, but mobilize what we already know. And the next slide. So here, the effort here is to, of course, guide and prioritize the national investment in science activities. Right up front, we are part of a science policy dialogue as we do the science planning. And this is communicating science as we do the planning for the science. And we're absolutely tying it to what our audience and client wants to use it for, which is developing a new national adaptation strategy and implementing the new Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. And some of you may be familiar with the kind of products, science communication products that come out of climate change research, whether it's an assessment on our climate, on our own changing climate, specific scaling factors to inform climate resilient buildings infrastructure, or also underpinning Canada's national Lyme disease strategy. Next slide. So it's not just doing the science communication. We are discovering there's a lot more to learn about science communication. And that's a specific piece of investigation that we want to move forward, specific to climate change. We know we have to understand the audiences in Canada and where those demographics, beliefs, biases influence their receptivity. We know we need to do more research around how to actually mobilize those knowledge synthesis products, effective tactics for knowledge mobilization, specific to audience. And we need to be able to understand the psychology of behavioral change and understand that science communication has a role in changing attitudes and behaviors. So lastly, the last slide, please. We repeat, science is evolving, knowledge is evolving, and we move through this observations of the environment, understanding that change, developing and applying the models, doing the science assessment and communication, informing policy, and understanding how society is responding to this, whether it is still acid deposition, ozone depletion, air quality, climate change. It takes more than one loop around the circle. So know that science communication and relationships are part of this iterative process, and we're refining our societal responses as the research unfolds. And just recently, the Climate Access Group came out with a playbook, and I really come back to this phrase. I think I understood it intuitively, but they put it out in black and white. Your science communication starts with listening and leading with empathy. Start where those audiences are at and build relationship with them. Hind, I think that's what I have to kick off your discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. That's a wonderful summary of your experience at the national level, and we hope that will spur some questions from the audience. Next, we have with us, and would like to welcome Professor Greg Evans from the University of Toronto. Greg is a decorated teacher and researcher whose areas of interest lie in urban air pollution and engineering education. A couple of his many notable awards include being recognized as a fellow of the Canadian Engineering Education Association in 2020 and receiving the 3M National Teaching Fellowship in 2017. Welcome, Greg. Take it away.
Well, thank you for the introduction. And it's great to see so many people joining us with this shared interest in science communication. So the prompt that I was given was to share a bit about my experience as a scientist, as an engineer, interacting with journalists, and I'll provide some background, some ways to frame your thinking, and some tips. So it'll be a more of a practical how-to, and hopefully the discussion will take us to some of the bigger pictures. So generally, my experience working with Canadian journalists has been very positive. I would say, for the most part, they really share our interest in providing interesting, understandable, accurate stories. They treasure the facts as much as we do. They treasure credibility as much as we do. And they share this goal in promoting what many people call kitchen conversations about science. The idea that this is something that we want people talking about all the time, casually. In just a few cases, have some overly ambitious journalists pushed the story past what was really credible, given the evidence, and I've seen that more often on TV reports rather than the radio and print, and I'll come back to that in a second. And I'll say my experience working with the US media has been quite different. There's a much more aggressive gotcha sort of approach, whereas my experience with Canadian media, as I say, it's been really very positive, and it's much more collaborative, and it's really nice when journalists contact me just to get that extra bit of background for a story. They just want to make sure they've understanding this correct, and by doing that, it helps reinforce that the message getting out there is correct. So three points about framing that I think about and that may be useful to you. One is, and I'll say this to graduate students, and I'll say this to junior colleagues, whenever we're working on a project, right from the outset, we start thinking about the broader implications and the relevance of the research. And our guiding questions are not unusual, but it is basically the so what question, to be able to see the bigger implications of what you're working on, the who cares question as to who this knowledge really should get out to, and the now what question. We've come to an end of a project, and what do we do with that? So thinking about those from the outset, and particularly thinking about them when you're trying to position your work in terms of making something more accessible for something like a story in the media. The second thing it's really important for us to realize as scientists and engineers is the data do not speak for themselves. They may speak to us and they may speak to a few experts on it, but it's really for us to provide the conceptual framing of the implications and what we claim can be done based upon these data. So it's important to think that and not believe that what you're showing them tells the whole story. It's for us with the expertise to provide that framing. And the last one I think has come more to mind these days is something called Perry's scheme, which is a scheme that was developed for undergraduate student learning in terms of how students, their perception of knowledge changes as they go through an undergraduate education. Basically, the idea is that many come out of high school into first year with what we call dualism, in their idea that there is the right and the wrong, and just show me how to do it, and is this the correct answer? By second and third year, they tend to get into more what we call multiplicity, as the idea that, well, there's a whole range of views, and then some get stuck on the idea that given that, they're all equally valid. That's kind of where I think we're at with a lot of the popular discussion these days on certain issues. Eventually, they get to the idea that context really matters, and you get into contextual relativism. And from that, they realize they have to take a stand. That's typically at the end of their degree, that given expertise, they need to make a commitment to one position. They're saying that this is what I believe based upon the evidence, and that's what we do as scientists and engineers. But I do point this out because I do think that the pandemic experience, where the public has been able to watch what we call science in action with all the uncertainty, all the twists and turns, and they're getting hung up on this idea of the multiplicity, where one thing said one day and next day we know better. But it means that all opinions are equally good. And for those of us that do have expertise in certain areas, we go, no, that's not quite the case. We're certainly willing to listen to all opinions, but actually some do have more weight than others. So put that in as well. In terms of, Marjorie talked about know your audience. And I think that's true as well when you're talking to a journalist, know that journalist's audience. And how they'll be really distributing the information. And there's a big difference between whether you're doing something for a printed story versus radio versus television. So a printed story, certainly the journalist will typically not share their story in advance. I mean, that's part of the journalism ethics, but they will take a chance to clarify. So there's more time on that one. Radio I find, is the best. Radio, you do have much more time to provide context, and it's easier to guide things back on track. Television is quick, and a lot of what you say when working with a reporter makes it into the story, but it's usually done with background pictures and graphs, etc. And they're just looking for that one sound bite to use as a quote to put a person in the story. And so you got to remember when speaking to pause so that they can clip that soundbite. Otherwise, you end up with this awkward run-on sentences they have to clip out. There's also the awkward intro shot that I've never mastered, where they want to introduce somebody as the speaker and they say, just walk down the hallway and we'll film you so that you're walking to the story. And it always looks so awkward on TV. So just a thought about that. The other one to be really aware of is whether the journalist is providing a local or a national news story, because that speaks to who your audience is going to be and what their level of interest will be. You got to focus on what you can say based upon your findings and not get hung up about all the uncertainty and what you can't say. It's fine to share that with the journalist, the reporter, but typically people are not interested in all the ambiguity and the uncertainty of the scientists. They just want to know, what can we now say thanks to the work that has been done? So put that out there. I guess I'll stop at this point. I could give you some examples of where things have gone right and where they've gone wrong, but I'll share the time for others.
Well, thank you, Greg. Appreciate your input and insights. So yes, we'll look forward to the towards the end when the floor is open for question and answer to elaborate more on the experiences you had. Okay. So the next speaker, Dr. Scott Hamilton, is not with us today, and I did not receive an email for why, but I'll tell you that why I invited Dr. Scott Hamilton. He's the managing editor of the Balsillie Papers, and the research coordinator at the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Waterloo, Ontario. Scott was one of Canada's Banting postdoctoral fellows and joined us, and he joined the Balsillie Papers as one of their associate editors when the paper started about a year ago. And since then, he transitioned from academia to administrative roles to create and facilitate and mobilize research and knowledge within universities, governments, and the public. So I'd like to post in the chat the link to the mandate of the Balsillie Papers, because I myself have published with them. Where is the chat? I think it disappeared on me. Yeah, let me just put down to everyone. Yeah, okay. So I'll leave that for you, the audience, to read about the mandate of the Balsillie Papers, because it's a new journal and they are really welcoming submissions from scientists and engineers who are, who have the experience of writing scientific papers, but not so much writing for policy audiences. And what I found from publishing with them is that the editorial team at their end is willing to work with me as somebody who's really fluent in writing technically for other scientists, but to help me translate what I'd like to write about from the science to make it sound readable for the policy audience. So that experience have been positive overall. There was, of course, back and forth in terms of the editorial process, but once your ideas are formulated and crystallized in a manuscript, the editorial team at that journal is willing to work with you. So I do encourage you, for those who are interested in getting the big picture of their work translated to policymakers, to consider the Balsillie Papers as one of the avenues to publish in, because of the positive experience I had with their editorial team. So now with that, I'll hand it to Kian to introduce the rest of today's speakers. Kian, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So unfortunately, Dr. Lin Xiaoyan isn't here with us either. A little bit about him, though, is that he's the associate editor of Nature Climate Change, where he handles manuscripts that pertain to policy and socioeconomic dimensions of climate change. So he was supposed to kind of supplement the policy perspective of the previous speaker. And prior to joining Nature Climate Change, he was an assistant professor in environmental and energy economics at South China Agricultural University and focused on how the environment impacted human welfare. So our next speaker who is present here with us is Sharon Oosthup, who is an award-winning science and nature journalist. Some of her publications can be found in the New Scientist, Canadian Geographic, Maclean's, and the Globe and Mail, just to name a few. She currently sits on the board of the World Federation of Science Journalists and is also a science writer for the Chemical Institute of Canada. Welcome, Sharon.
Thanks, Kian. I appreciate that. I'm coming to you from Victoria, the traditional territory of the Songhees. And I was asked to talk about how journalists decide on stories to feature and how scientists can more effectively interact with journalists to get their message out. So let's start with how journalists decide on stories. Some of this may sound obvious, but I'm sometimes surprised at how it isn't. And some of the other panelists may be touching on this as well. Impact is the most important element. That is, does the story impact readers or viewers? Does it have a direct consequence on their lives? Conflict is also important, and that's more about, you know, is the story newsworthy because human beings, conflict is important because as human beings we're interested in conflict. We tend to pay attention. So think of any book you've read or movie you've ever watched. They all had some sort of conflict to increase the dramatic volume. That doesn't mean it has to be a negative story. A lot of solutions stories have conflict in them, so don't confuse that. Timeliness, that is, the story has to be important now or soon will be. Something novel or counterintuitive is also like catnip to journalists. You know, when dog bites man, nobody cares, but if man bites dog, that's a news story. So the idea is any derivation from the normal course of events is novel and thus newsworthy. Human interest. People are interested in other people. Sometimes that will be you as the scientist. And I know you may not always be comfortable being front and center of a story. I know I'm not. But if you can humanize your research by showing why and how you're invested in it, it can really help sell the story in the media. As for how to interact more effectively with journalists, I think it really boils down to a couple elements. I know, Marjorie, you mentioned this already. Consider who you're talking to. Know your audience. What outlet does the journalist work for? What angle do they typically take? Are they a general assignment reporter, or in which case you're going to have to, you know, maybe hold their hand a bit more because they won't have the science background? Are they a science reporter, in which case maybe you can skip that? So you should have some idea of their level of expertise in your area. We all absorb information through the lens of our values, of course, and cultural identity. So many scientists believe if they simply share the facts, that the person they're talking to will automatically agree with them. I mean, the science is straightforward, right? But communications research shows that simply sharing more scientific information doesn't actually change minds or attitudes or behaviors. You know, these things are formed by our communities, our identities, our values. So instead of just sort of, you know, dumping knowledge on the journalist, try to understand who you're talking to. Ask questions, learn more about what matters to them. This helps you know which aspects of your research are most relevant, what you should prioritize when sharing your work, and how best to frame what you're sharing so they're likely to consider it. So start with what matters most to your audience. People want to know why your work is relevant to them. Sharing that first and coming back to it again later will help journalists remember your bottom line. That's never a bad thing. Effective science communication is less about cramming all the details you might want to convey and more about knowing what someone cares about and how to share your work in a way that matters to them. You should also learn to distill your research down to a couple points. And again, some of the other panelists have touched on this, and I'm glad. I know this is hard because you guys are the experts. You've studied the issue deeply. You understand all of its nuances. But again, cognitive research tells us that the human brain can only absorb 3 to 5 pieces of information at a time. So journalists don't have deep knowledge of your subject matter. Prioritize what you share based on what they need to know. It's also important to avoid jargon. While jargon can be really precise and important within your discipline, like if you're writing a scientific paper, to those outside your discipline is a foreign language often. And even if you define key terms at the start, every time you use them in a conversation with a journalist, they'll be like several steps behind you trying to translate those unfamiliar words rather than focusing on the message you want to convey. There are some programs out there designed to help scientists do this. I don't know if any of you have heard of COMPAS. It is a BC-based organization founded by science journalist Nancy Barron, and it offers scientists training about how to get their message across. They use something really useful, I think it's called the Message Box. I think it's brilliant. It's a multi-day program, so I won't attempt to reproduce it here, but briefly the Message Box starts with the issue, and then you move to 4 basic elements. And those elements are: so what, what's the problem, what's the solution, and finally, what are the benefits. For each element in the message box, they help you hone down the important message to 2 to 3 lines. Something else Compass trainers suggest, and which I think is quite helpful, is making a personal media kit for your research. You know, when it comes to science communications, don't underestimate the power of capturing short video clips, photos, audio of yourself, but it has to be sort of active stuff, like you in the field. Because, you know, journalists want to hear and see the cool stuff, because their audiences want to hear and see the cool stuff, but they can't always get out with you in the field, especially now with COVID. So really all you need is a smartphone and maybe a bit of advanced planning. If you also try to see it as part of sharing the who, how, what, and the where of scientific research, it can help you frame what it is you're saying more easily. So I think I've just about run out of time. I don't want to belabor it, and I want to leave more time at the end for questions.
Thank you so much, Sharon. While we were sharing all those tips, I was like, yes. Okay, so our next speaker is Inayat Singh, who is a journalist at CBC News and covers the environment and climate change policies in Canada. He is part of CBC's National Investigative Unit in Canada and specializes in data journalism. He's previously worked for CBC Manitoba and Winnipeg Free Press. Take it away.
Hi, so I actually did make a presentation that I was going to refer to myself, but I guess I can share my screen. It just won't be, so just a second. Oops. Okay, is that good? Okay, great, thank you. So my name is Inayat Singh and I cover the environment and climate change at CBC. My job is based in Toronto, but I'm part of a team that covers national news. So we're a small group of reporters who cover the environment, climate change, and we also work with local reporters and other departments like politics or business to kind of collaborate and be like the center for this kind of coverage at CBC. So a bit about my job, and this is, some of this is common to a lot of CBC journalists. So I do national coverage and my stories go on all platforms. That's online, radio, and TV. So usually I'm filing for all these platforms and that's pretty common for a reporter at CBC. It's a lot of work and that usually means 3 different kind of stories. But it's a way to, get our work on all our platforms and get the biggest audience for it. And one thing about CBC is that we cater to a general audience with perhaps varying levels of climate change awareness. So, I heard some panelists talk about knowing your audience, and at CBC, our audience is everyone. And that comes with certain challenges because, my challenge is to write stories that are relevant to average Canadians at home who are watching, the news show with a bunch of other stories, as well as policy experts and scientists in the field who might, find it interesting enough to share with their colleagues. We are trying to reach all of those audiences. So it's a challenge balancing those priorities. And some of the main topics I cover are energy policy in Canada, which is, a huge part of our climate change challenge. I'm really interested in nature-based climate solutions and challenges. So looking at things like conservation, looking at future carbon trading markets, anything that involves nature, because I think that's going to be, a big aspect of this climate change fight. And I also do a lot of coverage around federal climate policy and announcements. And so a bit about the people I speak to, and you'll see, academic research is at the top of that because I do, in my job, end up speaking a lot to researchers and and trying to create stories and projects that flow from some of the work that's being done. I also speak to a lot of non-partisan policy experts. And the reason I said non-partisan is because you also have, the political aspect, but a lot of our work is around, talking to non-partisan experts in various disciplines. So not just the environmental studies specifically, but we speak to economists and people in various sciences and applied sciences, engineering, and so on. And we speak to a lot of environmental organizations. We get a lot of stories from some of the advocacy work they're doing and some of the reports and lobbying efforts they're putting out. And then to kind of round out the story, we speak to a lot of businesses to get their reaction to things, or business owners, because a lot of climate policy affects those people. And then finally, a term we use called real people, which is difficult to define because in some cases it means, trying to just get, let's say, if it's a story about natural gas, trying to get a local homeowner to talk about how natural gas, whether they, how these policy changes affect their home heating bills. But real people can also mean sometimes researchers or, the people in the other groups above there who can kind of humanize or localize a story and make it more real for our audience. So I wanted to talk a bit about what I found from the other side of this, working in media, as some of the main challenges for researchers when they interact with journalists. And I've identified two broad umbrellas. So one is, just making reporters understand the academic research world. And, some of this has been mentioned by other panelists, what is and is not reportable, caveats in research, which, obviously are a huge part of research, but, journalists don't necessarily understand. And simple things like the publication, peer review process, but not just that, but the whole funding process and getting research funded and approved. Journalists don't necessarily have a good understanding of all of these things that a lot of academics may think is basic knowledge. So I'm someone who works with a lot of researchers and has spent a lot of time trying to, understand, okay, when we have a paper, what's reportable, what a preprint is, when a researcher has to be off the record, on the record, what is in their paper and what's just their opinion and analysis that maybe I should check with them before reporting. But I'm very careful about that, and other journalists may not be aware of that. So the solutions are, explain everything. Just go down to the basics. Just assume that, the journalist you're speaking to doesn't have, a handle on some basic concepts, and explain it. Journalists will not be offended. We love being explained like we're 5-year-olds. That really helps our job. So go, just go as basic as you can. The other thing is build relationships. So I have relationships with a lot of researchers I speak to often. And so they trust me. They know that I'll be responsible with the stuff they're telling me, and that I won't, try to find conclusions in their research that don't exist. So they can speak a little bit more freely with me. So if you do end up working with journalists and you see that, they're being accurate and they're being fair in the reporting and you had a good experience, build a relationship with those journalists who get it right, and use them to be the people you go to for your research first. Because if that first article is accurate and well reported, then all of the following coverage from other news organizations will also be the same. So it's really about rewarding journalists who get it right. And then, this came up as well, encourage journalists to clarify things before publication or ask questions. So again, we can't share our work with you, whether it's a full story or, an edited TV piece, but we certainly can run passages and parts of a story. So we can sometimes, for example, I will share a whole paragraph with a researcher saying that this is how I'm characterizing the conclusions of your paper in a paragraph. Is this right? Is this the right way to do it? So, you know, understand that while journalists can't share the entire story, they can share chunks of it. They can share some of the conclusions they're coming to, and encourage them to share that with you before publication, or at least make yourself available, you know, that you will be there. If they have questions, if they want to clarify anything, they can call you, email you. Just make yourself available and, you know, willing to help with that process. And then the second challenge I see is around telling a story. So this is the basic kind of disconnect between journalists and researchers, which is journalists have to tell a story, and that's not necessarily the point of a research paper. So what I find a lot is researchers, you know, they spend years sometimes on a paper, and it's all about like getting to that conclusion, right? So when they are speaking to me too, they are really focused on what they found. But your research is more than just your conclusions, and your whole process and all your work is interesting to somebody like us because we're trying to tell a story, not just report on your conclusions. So, you know, think about your whole process. Like, why did you do this research? When did you start? When did you even get interested in the topic that's being presented in the paper? Maybe like start from there. When you're being interviewed by a journalist, talk a bit about your motivations, and then talk about the work itself. You know, where did you do the work? The location, describe it. Who did you work with? Who were the people? How big was your team? I often ask researchers, can you tell me how big your team is and who's in it? So, you know, paint a picture. Like, are there 10 people? Are there students? Are they all based in one city, or do you have researchers scattered all over the world? All of these are very interesting parts of the whole story, and you know, are parts of the process that sometimes are not even mentioned in an academic paper, but definitely have a place in the story. And some of the solutions also are, you know, documenting the most mundane aspects of your work. So we find that, you know, some research is cool, right? You're going to, I don't know, the Arctic and doing field research, and you have interesting pictures to share, or you're going up in a plane or something like that. But some research is done in an office or a lab, or, you know, digging through archives. Well, that's still interesting to journalists. We sometimes, you know, send cameras and spend a lot of resources just to go into like someone's lab and shoot them at their desk. But that's what we need. So if that's your process, if you were doing work in a lab, take photos and video of that lab. It's not boring to us. You know, take those pictures throughout the process. Take pictures of your team, document, you know, if you took a flight somewhere, or you worked with an interesting piece of equipment. Maybe you used a supercomputer, or maybe you used data from a specialized satellite. Doesn't matter if it's just actually just you sitting at a computer. Maybe you can get, you know, pictures of the program you were using, or of you using this resource. But, you know, the mundane aspects of your work are still interesting. And talk to journalists about your motivations on your journey. I mentioned that, but, you know, really build a picture. Go work backwards from the conclusion of the paper and go back as far as you can and tell that story. One example that I wanted to give on this is I'm really interested in methane emissions in Canada, especially from oil and gas. So methane is, you know, it forms a huge chunk of our total greenhouse gas emissions, and it's a very potent greenhouse gas. And regulations to target methane are really like one of the most important climate-related policies targeted at the oil and gas sector. So I have built relationships with researchers who are trying to figure out how much methane is being emitted, because it's notoriously difficult to measure and estimate. And some of the work they're doing. And you can see here that, you know, the study that I'm talking about basically just identified that the main, you know, pieces of equipment that were leaking methane on an oil and gas site were not necessarily what were considered the main leakers before this research. So storage tanks, for example, were not considered huge sources. They actually are huge sources. That's kind of like, you know, the conclusion, which obviously is very important, but also kind of boring. But then you go into this research, it uses cutting edge laser technology. It includes planes flying over thousands of sites. That's a picture taken by the researcher of the plane from the ground. They probably never thought, you know, anybody would be interested, but we are, you know, it's interesting. So, you know, this is an example of a story where I've built a relationship with the researcher, used all this photo and video that they are sharing, and also being careful with reporting the kind of conclusions, because again, it's very tricky, the whole methane question. There are a lot of studies, for example, that show that the total amount of methane being emitted is far more than what's officially reported in Canada's greenhouse gas inventory. But I think Greg Evans, you said that, you know, journalists are trying to get that headline, sometimes that gotcha, you know, headline, which in this case would be, you know, Canada misreporting, or Environment Canada is getting it wrong. And that's not necessarily true. It's nuanced, it's different methodologies, and you need to have that relationship between the journalist and the researcher to explain those caveats and really get the message across in a clear way that's interesting, but not, you know, too over the top. That's my presentation. Yeah, I'm looking forward to any questions.
Thank you for that. So Hind, are we good to go into Q&A? Oh, you're muted.
I'm muted, yes. Yes, well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for the speakers. We are ready to go for the Q&A session. And for that, I will ask Fatima to actually stop the recording